Support for Focus Black Oklahoma on the KOSU Podcast Network comes from the Black Church Traditions and African American Faith Life program at Phillips Seminary, with a weekly chapel service celebrating Black History and African Heritage Month online at wherefaithleads.com/heritage.
This is Focus Black Oklahoma. I'm Colby Webster.
And I'm Ariel Davis. Focus Black Oklahoma and KOSU Radio were awarded a Solutions Journalism Network grant to examine how COVID-19 has affected the North Tulsa community in a three-part series called The Black Plague. The first segment explored the pandemic's effect on youth. This segment examines domestic violence, and our final program will look at evictions and homelessness.
Throughout this program, we will use the term survivor to describe those who have experienced domestic violence. Due to security and privacy concerns, some names have been changed. We also want to let listeners know that there may be some disturbing details or information shared.
The United Nations Entity for Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Women, also known as UN Women, says that even before the pandemic, domestic violence was one of the greatest human rights violations around the world. In the last 12 months, more than 240 million women and girls between the ages of 15 to 49 have been subjected to sexual or physical violence by an intimate partner. The term intimate partner violence is useful for quickly communicating the complex issues that survivors face, but it waters down the meaning for those who have been fortunate enough not to be touched by the lived experience.
People who hear the term intimate partner violence, but who haven't experienced it, do not have a clear enough picture of what those words mean. Let's make these terms and numbers clear. 240 million women and girls have been scratched, pushed, shoved, thrown, bit, choked, slapped, violently shaken, hit, burned, raped, or sexually assaulted. They've endured public humiliation and name-calling. Violent partners limit their access to transportation, money, friends, and family. They use survivors' vulnerabilities against them, such as immigration status and physical or intellectual disabilities, to assert dominance and control. However, women and girls are not isolated in their suffering.
In Oklahoma, 49% of women and 40% of men have experienced intimate partner violence at some time in their lives. In the city of Tulsa, more than 22,000 calls to 911 were made related to domestic violence in 2017. Survivors don't have a specific look or lifestyle. Survivors are the kids who keep falling asleep in class, the grandmothers planning the church picnic, powerful career women, and men who are putting in overtime at work. Some survivors are simultaneously juggling poverty and abuse, while others are juggling abuse and social pressure.
Domestic violence touches many lives beyond the person who is under attack. It touches the ears of nearby residents who hear the loud screams of the neighbors on the floor above. It touches the eyes of children who watch their mothers spit in the face of their father. It touches the hearts of the domestic violence prevention workers who diligently help survivors in often life-threatening situations. During times of crisis, such as a pandemic, domestic violence is known to increase, but by how much can be hard to determine. Experts say the pandemic may have caused a perfect storm of tension that led to increased violence, including issues surrounding health, money, and security.
I'm finna get away out of here. find my way home. I'm about to get I'm finna get away out of here. Before the street light come on. I'm about to get I'm finna get away out of here. Find my way home. I'm about to get I'm finna get away out of here. Before the street light come on.
Hope is a survivor. Though it's not her real name, she believes it stands for what survivors of domestic violence can achieve with help. To understand Hope's story, she says it's important to first understand another story that started in the 1960s. It begins with a woman named Mary, who married an abusive man. Together, they had 4 children. When Mary tried to leave the relationship, people that she loved and trusted to have her best interest at heart, to guide her when she felt uncertain and confused, told her she needed to return to take care of her 4 children. The youngest of these 4 children was an innocent baby boy.
When the youngest one was just a baby, she left and tried to go back to another state to her family. And when she went back, they said, well, you have to go back. You have 4 kids. He's the good provider. You don't have a choice. You have to go back. And she did. And she did the best she could, to try to make things work and figure out how to navigate through it.
Jump to 1989 when Hope got married. She married Mary's innocent baby boy, now a grown man.
As soon as we were married, it's like I was reliving the things that she had shared with me that had happened in her marriage in the early years. It is something that travels down from parents to children, and I think that's a huge issue.
Her husband had very strong Christian beliefs, and Hope says she soon started noticing things that made her uncomfortable. She says those strong beliefs started manifesting into controlling behaviors.
And I started noticing the controlling things, not abuse, but just control. And I was like, what is this? But of course, there's always, especially out here in the religious section or, sector, you always think, well, it'll be better when I get married. Or, think God will help me. This is going to be good. And so once we got married, it was more the verbal abuse at first and the controlling escalated, but it didn't take very long, just a few months before the physical started. And it was more like pinching or shoving or squeezing.
Hope left her husband 12 times. She didn't return because she enjoyed being pinched, shoved, or squeezed. Like so many married couples, Hope was trying to work through the struggles of her marriage and love an imperfect partner. She would return thinking if she just did everything right, made a few changes, became perfect, and loved him the right way, she could stop the abuse from happening and keep the marriage intact. Hope worked to improve the marriage, but the abuse still persisted. They started trying to have a family in an attempt to improve their relationship, but they had difficulties, including a miscarriage and stillborn babies. Hope's husband blamed her for the difficulties, telling her repeatedly that she didn't believe strongly enough and it was her fault her body had trouble maintaining a healthy pregnancy.
That's where the religious abuse was really bad, because he blamed me, that it was my fault that the babies died because I didn't have enough faith and they were in my body. And that was very hard. And I know there's a lot of women that I've talked to that are caught up in that, where the faith that they've lived with and believed in for so long is actually turned around to be a weapon against them, so to speak.
While Hope struggled to conceive a healthy baby, to grieve for her lost children, and save her marriage, eventually she ended up getting pregnant and had a baby boy.
But I will say the religious abuse is very, very detrimental to a person, and it's like you become brainwashed, because what you believed in and what you hold on to is now being turned against you. And I didn't have even my own thoughts anymore. It's like my thoughts were overtaken by him and what he said about me, or what, the things that he said. But the abuse was bad during that time physically, even when I was pregnant and even when my son was just a baby.
Still, the abuse continued. It became increasingly dangerous for Hope, who endured mental, emotional, and physical abuse at the hands of her husband. She says she lived in constant fear for herself and her son.
I lived in fear all the time. And now I had a baby that I was, my son, that I just was trying to protect and take care of. And he didn't harm our son during those years. He was very protective over him, but he always accused me of trying to hurt him or do wrong things. But I just remember that day, my son woke up and was crying, and I just thought, I was laying on the floor, and I just thought, you gotta run. You gotta get up and run. And I did, and I ran to the office of our complex, and they called the police. And that was the first time that I had heard of Divis. And at that time, they did give me a card, and the police officer talked to me, and said, you need to get help because a lot of times this gets worse.
DIVIS stands for Domestic Violence Intervention Services. It's a nonprofit organization with a counseling facility in North Tulsa. The mission of DIVIS is to rebuild lives affected by domestic violence and sexual assault through advocacy, shelter, counseling, and education. During the pandemic, it has offered support to survivors through a new texting service and created new safety protocols. Hope's story takes place before the pandemic started, but it's emblematic of the challenges that survivors face. The pandemic has compounded those challenges, increasing isolation and creating economic, health, and safety worries for individuals from all backgrounds. Hope received counseling and help with legal services to get a divorce and a protective order through DIVIS.
It wasn't until I actually went to a DIVIS intake and went to group counseling, and it was quite a few years later that I did, that I saw the cycle that I was in and started really, the information was helping me so much to see this wasn't me, this wasn't my fault. It was just, this is what I was in.
Hope's story is personal to her experience, but unfortunately, it isn't isolated or unique. Every 60 seconds, a person in the United States is assaulted by an intimate partner. That means that each minute Hope was pinched, shoved, or violently squeezed, she was joined in her pain by at least 19 other people nationwide.
I went to DIVIS several different times, and each time I got stronger, and I can remember going to those group meetings, and we would be sitting there just talking about what was going on in our lives, and we all came from different kind of backgrounds, but our stories had this common thread.
The statistics quoted in this story are more than numbers. They represent real people who experience real pain and suffering. It's easy to dismiss the stories when they are told in numbers. It isn't until those numbers touch your mother, father, sister, brother, best friend, cousin, or someone you care deeply for that they become real. It's easy to say that a survivor should just leave or get help, but it's important to dig deeper because what is often found is that leaving or getting help is not the same for everyone. Accessing help is not easy or simple, especially when survivors face barriers outside of their violent partners.
Notes on the Woman Upstairs by J.M. Morey. This year it falls. It's the sound I want nothing to do with. Heavy boots dropping, voices muddied and agitated as ink blots. The temper of light shortened, the ceiling trembles, the begging and breathing, how sobbing can be confused for love. Silence. Are you trying to lift the floor, vision sprained, soft focus, slow motion? In a home like this, silence is like love. Too many meanings and rarely what it seems. Lamplight cascading, doors slammed and dresser drawers thrown open on the bed, an empty suitcase. But who begins tossing in clothes? Silence. What is the sound of that first look in the mirror of seeing yourself swollen shut? It's the sound I want nothing to do with. From this room below, I swear it, I've seen night dragging you by your hair towards morning.
Yolanda Knox is another survivor. She was married for 7 years and says that up until she found out he had been cheating, she felt things were going well. When she found out there was cheating involved, she grew angry.
And let me be fair. When I first found out that he had cheated, I hit on him. It wasn't necessarily, I did, and that's my fault. And it turned into a match where he ended up choking me. And that was, again, my fault. Well, I say that we shouldn't put our hands on each other, period. So with that being said, I wanted to try and do whatever I could to save my relationship, but I didn't realize the violence was escalating. Like every now and again, he would just grab me and I'm thinking it's passionate. It's not passionate. It's violent.
It escalated to one evening when she was kicked in the mouth, forcing her to run out of the house for her safety.
I ended up running out of the house. I had no clothes on. It was really an ugly fight. I ended up losing a tooth behind it. And the next day I did go to work. And while I was at work, one of the teachers kind of saw that I was not okay and together and took me to somebody that she knew. And we talked and they said, you know, he's eventually going to kill you.
She ended up moving into an apartment with her 3 kids.
How it's evolved into what I am now. I am a licensed therapist now, and I do this thing called the DJ Dime. 1, because I used to DJ, and 2, because I love to dance. So I would say, hey, I'm Siani, your DJ and dance junkie with today's little bitty DJ Dime, and I try to promote self-esteem, and I try to promote self-worth. And I have a coaching business, which, you know, hasn't picked up yet, but I'm taking freebies. And I did a divorcing women's group and I did a battered women's group. Here's the thing. And I was very idealistic because I'm getting my master's degree, you know. Battered women are not going to just come out and say this is what's going on. It's a lot of shame that goes with the territory. And not because they're being abused, but because they feel like they could have done something different to make it work. And that's never the case. And a lot of people don't want to come out because they don't want their husband or their mate or whatever, you know, because domestic violence also happens in the LGBTQ community as well, because they don't want to shame that other person. And I had to learn that we are not shaming. Had they acted better, then the story we tell would not hurt. The stories we have are our stories.
Underserved communities can face even greater barriers to get services. Those communities include residents with limited English language skills, incarcerated individuals, LGBTQ community members, rural community members, and the deaf or hard of hearing. Molly Bryant is an outreach advocate for such communities.
Historically, in the domestic violence movement, these populations were really left out. They were trying to be heard, but were really left out of the movement. So we're doing a lot of attempting to rebuild that. So yeah, it's the LGBTQ community, the deaf and hard of hearing community, those with limited English, or really like immigrants, usually rural residents, and people who are incarcerated.
Bryant discusses some of the underserved populations and how Divis serves them, starting with the LGBTQ community.
LGBTQ individuals for so long were left out of the movement just because forever people assumed and talked about domestic violence as being between a man and a woman, the man being the abuser and the woman being the victim in the situation. And we know that that's not always the case. So that leads to a lot of the barriers for LGBTQ survivors. So one of the barriers is just this lack of understanding around like what domestic violence actually looks like and the different forms it can take and different relationships that it can show up in. Also, homophobia is a big reason. That's a huge barrier. So anytime there is like a form of oppression against you, that's going to be a barrier to not just seeking services, but just like going out into the community and identifying yourself and that like marginalized identity. Also, honestly, going in and seeking services whenever you are LGBTQ, you have to out yourself whenever you go into a domestic violence agency and say that you're in this relationship. You typically have to out yourself. And that's a really scary thing whenever you don't know how that service provider is going to react.
She says abusers may use gender norm myths against domestic violence survivors to further oppress survivors.
So abusers will often use these myths that we have around domestic violence to further isolate and keep their victims from seeking any type of help. So they may use those myths like, you can't be a survivor of domestic violence because you are a man or because you're trans. And so there's just a lot of different reasons, but those are some of the biggest barriers.
The Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network, known by many as RAIN, which serves as a partner for more than 1,000 local sexual assault service providers across the United States, has clear examples of how intimate partner violence can occur amongst LGBTQ community members. According to RAIN, LGBTQ community members who experience intimate partner violence may have a more challenging time self-identifying as a survivor. This is because the survivor's experience with sexual assault does not fit his or her idea of what sexual violence looks like or who may be involved. Consider Isabella's story from RAIN's website.
When Isabella Mosqueda was a freshman in high school, she was struggling with mental health issues and had a hard time opening up. A friend introduced her to Rachel, which is not the perpetrator's real name, a senior at their school who was going through similar challenges. Their friendship blossomed quickly. Isabella says it was super refreshing. According to Isabella, she had only been in small conservative private schools and never felt like she could talk to someone about her mental health issues or the abusive household in which she grew up. She says for a while, her relationship with Rachel was kind of magical. She says they started dating 3 months later. Isabella says what began as a balanced relationship soon grew controlling. She says it's hard to say when the abuse started. When she and Rachel were first dating, it was like a Disney story. They would talk 24/7. Rachel wrote her a love song and they danced in the snow. But then Isabella says things started changing, subtly at first. Rachel became adamant about knowing her whereabouts and would call her incessantly. Rachel also tried to control what clothes Isabella wore. Eventually, Rachel convinced Isabella to abandon her other friends and family. Isabella says she felt crappy sometimes, but convinced herself it was because Rachel cared about her and she wanted to keep her safe. It's taken Isabella many years to come to terms with the physical coercion that also existed in the relationship. The first time she and Rachel kissed was the first day they started going out. She says she wasn't ready, but Rachel told her they needed to make their relationship official. The abuse eventually escalated. When Isabella told Rachel she wasn't ready to have sex, Rachel asked her, "Well, don't you love me?" Isabella said, "Yes, of course," but Rachel wanted her to prove it. For the next 4 months, Rachel continued to coerce Isabella into sexual acts. After it happened the first time, and every time after that, Isabella would take a shower and scrub herself clean. Then she would cut herself and try to get Rachel out of her. Isabella says it's important to her that queer survivors know their stories are valid. She says many people don't believe queer survivors because they don't understand same-sex violence. Isabella wants queer survivors to know she believes them, and they will find others who believe them too.
Read Isabella's story and more stories like hers at RAINN.org. That's RAINN.org.
View.
Queer survivors are not the only group who face unique challenges because of the intersections of their identities. Another group Bryant works with is the immigrant community and those with low English proficiency.
Unfortunately, in Oklahoma, and I mean most places in the US, there are a lot of barriers. In Oklahoma, we have anti-immigrant policies that are significant barriers for survivors of any crime, but survivors of domestic violence from seeking services out in the community. So policies like 287G in Tulsa County is a huge barrier for any survivor.
Section 287G of the U.S. Immigration and Nationality Act authorizes the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, to deputize selected state and local law enforcement officers to enforce federal immigration law. The Tulsa County Sheriff's Office adopted this policy in 2007. Though the policy was federally drafted, there is no statute or mandate requiring state and municipal governments to adopt or enforce its use. To be clear, policy participation by local police is optional.
Even though they may themselves be a survivor, interacting with any type of formal system is really scary. And they know and have heard stories of survivors being misidentified or somehow getting caught up in the system, which then leads to deportation. We also know just that fear of deportation keeps people in their homes and keeps people from interacting with people outside of their families or outside of their community. For immigrants, again, like racism, xenophobia, huge. You don't, again, know who you're going to be interacting with. And that's a huge barrier and a huge risk anytime you walk into a space not knowing how someone's going to react to you and if you're going to get taken seriously because of who you are. And for a lot of immigrants, and particularly newly arrived immigrants, language is a massive barrier. Although like at Divis, we offer interpretation services and we have a lot of staff who speak languages other than English. Language also just isolates you. If you don't speak English in Oklahoma, you're not going to be able to pick up on a lot of things. So you're not going to be able to know what the services are in your community. You're not going to hear on the radio what's going on. Abusers know that and will use that. They may prevent them from learning that language. They may prevent them from working so that they can learn English.
Bryant says there is fear in all communities, but especially in immigrant communities, which is heightened right now due to the political discourse around immigration. Some immigrant community members may not know domestic violence services are available locally because such services were not around in their countries of origin.
There's fear of children being taken away if they contact us for their own services because they know that DHS may have to get involved. And it's terrifying for DHS and child welfare to get involved in a case whenever you don't speak the language as your child's caseworker. They do get involved. And so it's really, really, really scary. Everything about it is scary. I will often meet with people who are from Central America in particular and Southeast Asia who honestly didn't have services in their home country. So then when they come to the US, no matter if they're here, documented, fully documented, semi-documented, undocumented, they may never have actually heard of domestic violence or sexual assault services. So they just didn't fathom that idea. And so that lack of home services in their home country is a barrier to them receiving them here. Because if you just don't know that they exist, you wouldn't know to seek them out.
To fully support all individuals, Divis works with all languages. Many staff members speak Spanish, and Divis will work with interpreters for other languages.
Ideally, we would have an in-person interpreter for every language. That's not the case because interpreters in Tulsa and also funding. If we can schedule ahead of time for spoken language, we will provide in-person interpretation for like court hearings, counseling appointments, any type of appointment that we can schedule ahead of time. We will get an in-person interpreter. The places that we work with can, for the most part, find in-person interpreters for any of the languages that we've needed, which has been wonderful because we've had Southeast Asian languages, Eastern African languages, languages that we didn't expect to have interpreters for. But we also have a language line, which is not always best practice for long-term counseling, but it is something that we need to have because we have people who are walking in crisis. We need to be able to provide services on the spot. So we have a language line that we use pretty consistently. If we can't actually identify the language, we even have identification cards where someone can actually point to their language. We've even had times where they weren't sure and they couldn't point to it, but we call the language line and they can somehow identify it. It's really amazing. So we do everything we can because if you can't speak in your own language, you're not really getting proper services. So we do everything we can to make sure that we have certified interpreters who are doing all of our interpretation for everything. And again, certified interpreters are different than just like, we never have family members who are interpreting. We don't do anything like that because that's not really safe.
Bryant says there is an active Spanish language community in Tulsa, as well as Spanish-speaking media outlets. According to a report conducted by New American Economy for the city of Tulsa, there were 55,000 immigrants in Tulsa County in 2018. Of that population, the 3 most spoken languages at home, other than English, among those with limited English proficiency, were Spanish, Burmese, and Vietnamese.
I partner with the YWCA Immigrant and Refugee Services, and then we partner with Tulsa Immigrant Resource Network and a lot of other organizations that are already active in these immigrant and refugee communities to make sure that they know about our services and that we're working collaboratively. At the YWCA, they also have people on staff who are from the Hmong and Vietnamese communities who are doing that outreach and then partnering with us to make sure that we're all working together because it's really tough, especially in those smaller refugee communities that are more newly arrived in Oklahoma. They are tighter knit, and so it is harder to get in there. And I have to be honest, we're still learning what would be the best, most culturally responsive services too, because I think we have a pretty good handle on what that looks like in Latinx cultures, but Southeast Asian cultures, it's really different. And we're learning a lot of what those kind of services might look like to best meet their needs, which will look very, very different than Latinx cultures.
Another community with fewer resources is the rural community. Bryant says Divis works in both Tulsa and Creek counties.
Creek County is like majority rural, and our Creek County office sees a lot of those barriers. Whenever I first started this job, I went around to a lot of the other rural domestic violence agencies. We're really lucky in that we have tribal and mainstream domestic violence agencies who are doing rural work. So as far as Divis goes, we do rural work in Creek County, but our partner agencies are doing the really tough rural work, and we do what we can to support them.
A lack of transportation is a barrier for many survivors in Oklahoma, and it's no different for those in rural parts of the state.
It's always the main issue because rural counties are vast. They're expansive. If they want to seek services, they have to drive hours to get there. But also survivors, if they want to leave an abusive situation, they have to leave somehow, right? They have to physically leave. And if you're living in a rural community and you don't have access to your own private transportation, you're out of luck. You have to borrow someone's car. You have to ask for a ride. Another complication with that is you're in a rural community where everyone knows everyone. So if you ask for a ride, your abuser is probably going to know you asked that person for that ride. Everything gets much more complicated. You can't walk anywhere. So transportation is huge.
A lack of reliable transportation can be especially isolating in a rural community.
Isolation physically in rural communities, again, you're physically isolated from people. You're also isolated because you only have a certain amount of people probably that you're able to reach out to. So whenever I work with clients and they're In rural communities, you have to be they have to be a lot more thoughtful about who they can trust. Whenever you have like a vast amount of people that you're surrounded by and a lot more people in your community, there's only so many places you can go in a rural area, right? It's really, really complicated.
The isolation can be exacerbated by a lack of employment opportunities, which can impact finances. Some survivors may not have access to their own finances, increasing the challenge of leaving abusive partners.
There's unemployment, there's poverty, there's not a lot of affordable housing. So where do you even move to if you try to get out of a rural area? And also that rural area is your community. So you're also leaving all of your support.
Justice involved and incarcerated individuals are another group with whom Bryant works.
Partly because there are so many barriers, partly because they are often the most marginalized in Oklahoma and in Tulsa. So I feel really, really lucky to be able to work with these survivors and witness their journey. But barriers for justice-involved individuals, you could write a novel about it, right? And you could write a whole historical novel of how it all happened and why people are incarcerated because of sexual violence and domestic violence. It's all connected. But for people who are currently incarcerated and who are recently incarcerated, some of the barriers are, if you have been incarcerated, when you get out, your options for finding housing are incredibly limited. You're not able to apply you're able to apply, but you'll be denied for most public housing if you have a felony. You won't be able to access federal student loans, so you can't get an education. You'll probably have an enormous amount of fines and fees. So you'll leave that system in debt, unable to live anywhere, unable to have an education. Most places won't hire you. So you're just going to be stuck in this cycle of poverty.
She says poverty intensifies domestic violence.
You're just stuck in this cycle, and there's not much that you can do to get out of it. And there aren't a lot of policies to remove these barriers right now. So there's certain movements around reducing felonies for drug crimes, but things are not looking great at the moment as far as reducing felonies for other nonviolent offenses.
Before the pandemic, Bryant's work involved going into the Tulsa County Jail and meeting with clients. She says people in jail have few resources.
You have DIVIS, Women in Recovery, and you have a couple other service providers who are going to let you know about your rights. That was pre-COVID. Now you have almost no one, but you have very limited access to resources. And you're also in a system that is perpetuating power and control. If you're a survivor who is in the system for any reason, you are then living again under this pretty abusive power and control system. So that's a huge barrier to finding like any healing. And then again, we also know that people who are incarcerated, who are charged and convicted and incarcerated are disproportionately people of color, people from lower classes, people with marginalized identities. So some of those barriers, again, go back to forms of oppression like racism, classism, sexism.
Bryant says that before COVID, she used to visit with survivors at Tulsa County Jail several days a week. Since the pandemic started, she has no access to survivors. She reaches some clients by phone, but it's not confidential.
We're not really able to discuss much, and it's hard for me as a social worker, knowing that it's not confidential. It's really difficult to feel okay communicating too much. So right now, there's not a lot we can do. In the past, I was leading support groups in the Tulsa County Jail for anyone, but I was also particularly leading support groups for women on immigration holds in Tulsa County. And so that was kind of like the intersection of incarcerated individuals and immigrants. And I was doing support groups around sexual violence and domestic violence. They were there for months and months on end. So we worked on healing and building community while they were there in the jail, safety planning, all kinds of things. Unfortunately, it's just not happening right now.
Bryant says that, anecdotally, the vast majority of women who are in Tulsa County Jail are survivors of some form of sexual violence.
Statistically speaking, 2/3 of women in prison in Oklahoma are survivors of domestic violence as an adult. So 2/3, that's like what it says. 2/3 of women in prison were also physically or sexually abused as children. Almost half of women in prison in Oklahoma reported being raped as an adult. The intersection of who is experiencing domestic violence and sexual violence, and then who then later is being incarcerated, possibly for coping with the trauma of these horrible experiences, is really, really strongly aligned. While I've definitely seen survivors who are convicted for fighting back or being misidentified as victims, like the majority of who I see in our criminal justice system are survivors who are in there for drug offenses. But what we know is that using drugs, substance abuse, are forms of, they're unhealthy, but they're forms of coping with trauma. People are women in particular, are being incarcerated for survivorship.
The other group Bryant works with is the deaf and hard of hearing community.
There's a lot of mistrust of the hearing community. So if you're deaf, there's a lot of reason for mistrust, and most deaf individuals will not go to a hearing organization. They haven't got what they needed. They've been treated poorly, and they don't get what they need. And so there's just a lot of mistrust.
Bryant notes that domestic violence can affect anyone, regardless of their socioeconomic status. But in places where chronic community stressors exist, which can range from food insecurity to lack of job opportunities, these added challenges create prime conditions for violence to form and spread.
In a community like North Tulsa that has been ravished by systemic oppression, by policies aimed at marginalizing this community from necessary resources, I think we know that rates might be higher. They probably are. I don't know that we see that in our numbers. I don't know that we see that in our data. I wouldn't expect to necessarily see that in Tulsa Police Department's data for a lot of reasons that I think we could go into. There's a lot of different reasons why that wouldn't show up in data.
Obstacles that survivors face in North Tulsa include a lack of transportation, scarce affordable childcare, and a lack of employment opportunities. She says this doesn't even touch on the historical trauma within the community.
I think we can assume that survivors of domestic violence in North Tulsa are experiencing more barriers, just like we talk about marginalized identities. We can assume that they're also experiencing more barriers to seeking help than people in Midtown. Even though we don't always see it come out in numbers, we know it's there.
I'm about to get I'm gonna get away out of here before the street light come on. I'm about to get I'm gonna get away out of here. Find my way home. I'm about to get I'm gonna get away out of here before the street light come on. Gotta get home before the street light come on. Gotta go home. Street light come on. Passing forward, still ignored it. Understand.
One way Divis seeks to end the cycle of violence is through a program called the Batterers Intervention Program. Matt Youngberg is an offenders counselor with the program in Tulsa. He says the program, which is certified through the Oklahoma Attorney General's office, primarily serves Department of Human Services and court-ordered clients. The year-long program offers offenders a way to avoid jail, learn better coping habits, and deal with underlying issues through small group settings. Though Youngberg works strictly with men, there is also a program for women.
One of the primary goals is to talk about their power and control for both themselves and for the people around them. Then we focus heavily on accountability. We try to get them to look kind of deeper into themselves and try to figure out what are they responsible for, what are they accountable for, and try to give them a perspective to change their belief systems and their understanding of the way that relationships works, the way that they work. And so we introduce different topics. So the Attorney General has 11 different topics that we cover throughout the year, ranging from parenting to better communication, to consequences of domestic violence on children.
Youngberg says many of the participants have been around domestic violence in some form during their lives, compounding the generational effects. Going back to Hope's story, one can see how growing up in a violent home can affect a person well into adulthood.
By using these programs, we're able to give them more resources and more tools, more perspectives, and for a lot of people, just support for them to figure out whatever it is that they need to figure out for them in their lives. And so without programs like this, they're just going to go on with business as usual, and there's never going to be a reason or a cause for change, because for most of them, they don't realize that there is something wrong. They don't realize that there is a change. I talk about in group that no villain thinks that they're the villain. They believe they're doing the right things until someone points out that, wait a minute, you're probably not doing the right thing and you probably need to look at it differently.
The weekly 90-minute meetings cover various topics about domestic violence and its trappings, including reflection time and questions to better understand the material.
One of the biggest priorities for me is to challenge any of the behaviors, right? Negative behaviors, inappropriate behaviors, sexist behaviors, all of the above. And when we look at the side of the group setting for that, we're also able to allow their peers, the people in group, to be able to kind of confront them in a good, healthy, positive way so that they can get practice at both giving feedback and receiving feedback from other people.
Youngberg says he tries to apply the teachings to all areas of one's life, not just a romantic relationship, but also family, fellow workers, children, and friends.
The pandemic has made it more difficult for survivors who were already having a hard time coping. Survivors have less opportunity to reach out for help when abusers are nearby. Assaults have increased due to violent partners being home more often. To combat that, Divis worked with two local charitable organizations, the George Kaiser Family Foundation and the Schusterman Family Foundation, to create a texting service that allows users to connect to a Divis advocate via text message. Divis Chief Development Officer Janae Day says the service has been something that the nonprofit has wanted for a while.
It's an opportunity for us to enable another lens of contact for those that are in need. Sometimes you're not able maybe to get away for a phone call, maybe social media is monitored. And so just having as many avenues as possible for a survivor to get the help that they need, I think is just absolutely impactful. And the fact that both of those foundations not only recognized and understood that, but were willing to sit on various calls with us really and talk through what that meant for the longevity, how do we continue it. And so really being part of that process is amazing. So we're extremely grateful for that. And I think one of the things that I always like to flag is that you go into it with an intention of having that additional avenue. And another added benefit to that is for the deaf and hard of hearing community. It's, again, just another lens that didn't exist before that they can reach out and receive services to.
Jenny Saldivar is the advocate supervisor at Divis Safe Housing Shelter.
The texting line is something that we started up kind of at the beginning of all of this with COVID. So that's just an additional way that survivors can reach out to us. And it's also been like a really helpful tool for the deaf community, because our main way of communication before that was through the phone. And while we did have some interpretation available, it's been easier to have this text line for survivors to call in, or if they're not comfortable, it adds that anonymity maybe to it, so that survivors are more comfortable reaching out to us.
Saldivar says that the texting service is available from 8 p.m. to 1 a.m. People can text HELP to 207777 every day of the week if they are in need in order to reach a Divis employee. For those who use the service, she says advocates will ask questions to assess how they can best help.
We basically just ask, what is the reason that you're texting in today? What can we do to help? And then depending on what they say is maybe it's creating a safety plan, maybe it's referring them to another community resource, or maybe it's hey, this sounds like a really good situation for you to come. If it's safe for you to come to our outpatient building and come in person, and we can either refer you to our counseling services or our legal services. So really just whatever it is that person that's texting in needs.
Saldivar and her team answer any crisis calls via phone that come in after hours. COVID-19, like most everything, has fundamentally changed the way the shelter works.
Before COVID, we were able to bring in a whole lot more people into our shelter. Now with COVID, we have to be really mindful of how many people we're bringing into the shelter. And then also, as far as like when we do have to refer people out, because our community partners are so tapped out, we try to do really intentional safety planning with clients to help them find whatever resources they already have.
She says that when clients do come in, masks are required and all staff wear protective gear.
Another resource that survivors can use with DIVIS is its legal team. Megan Martin is Vice President of Legal Services, overseeing both attorneys and advocates.
As far as the attorneys go, we take cases for survivors in the family law area, so divorce, paternity, dealing with custody, child support. We also have a position that's part-time. It's a juvenile attorney that represents parents, survivors of DV in juvenile court on the deprived action.
Martin also oversees court advocates, which may work on either the criminal side or the protective order side. There is also a law enforcement liaison who helps navigate the Tulsa Police Department. The TPD liaison follows up with anyone who has reported strangulation to make sure they are safe and encourage them to seek services. They are also available to help clients file police reports and can help follow up on the status of those reports. The liaison's office is within the TPD Family Violence Unit, so she works daily with the detectives in that unit. Martin and her team help survivors fill out protective orders, which can be daunting for someone unfamiliar with such documents and systems.
And there are a lot of rules that go into even getting a protective order. You have to be a resident of the Tulsa County if you're filing in Tulsa, or the other party has to, or the incident happens. So there's all these just first hurdles you have to get through. Do you qualify for a protective order? So one of the things we do a lot of is people come in and they're like, my neighbor's been screaming and yelling and I want a protective order. That really doesn't qualify for a protective order. So it's trying to help clients understand what the nature of a protective order is and what it's not. So that's one thing that we try and do when people come in for a protective order is just assess, is this the best situation? Is this what you need?
But at the end of the day, she says it is a piece of paper. Some people will abide by it and some people won't.
So along with the protective orders, we always give very detailed safety plans tailored to the individual because we may have issues with service. Sometimes if information is missing, law enforcement can't serve it. It's not uncommon that people come in and they don't know where the defendant is. They don't have an address. They may be homeless. They may be going around to different houses. They just don't know where to find this person to serve them. Doesn't mean they can't get a protective order. It just means it's not in effect until the person gets service. That happens a lot. So protective orders by statute have to be heard within 14 business days of the protective order. It has to be set for hearing. So we have sometimes 2 weeks for law enforcement, who by statute is the one that can serve our protective orders, to find the person to serve them. If they can't, in 2 weeks, when the client goes to court, they can ask the judge to continue the protective order for another 2 weeks to allow them time to find the defendant. We have some protective orders we've been following that have been continued since 2018 because we can't find the person. Doesn't mean they're not around. Doesn't mean they're still not impacting or threatening the client. It just means we can't get them served.
Martin adds that it's beneficial to have one because it's a paper trail, and if someone violates a protective order, they can be charged criminally. One important thing to note about the legal system is that it requires a survivor to retell their story, sometimes multiple times, in multiple settings, with multiple people present, maybe even the offender, often re-traumatizing the victim.
The legal process doesn't make it easy for survivors in a trauma-informed setting. We try to limit the number of times a client would have to testify. We try and do it in a gentle manner that is as least trauma-invoking as possible, but at the same time, we need facts to get out so that if it's in front of a jury, they can be well-informed and make an appropriate, hopefully, ruling and decision. But it doesn't lessen the fact that a survivor is continuously going to have to tell their story, and not only tell their story, but then that opens them up to cross-examination. So then they get questioned, and it can be not a pretty situation when you're questioned, as well as you don't know who's sitting on the jury. It could be somebody who knows somebody you know. It could be somebody in your kid's class for all you know. So then there's just that exposure to your community and your public.
Get on. When he confused on why you leaving, then accuse you of not having no feelings. When you holding up the evidence, gotta get home before the street. When you reading it on the billboard, the message applies. Believe it when you see it, girl, the tantrums aside. Before the street light.
Every year, Divis hosts a fundraising event called the Monarch Ball to raise funds to support programs. Due to COVID-19, the in-person event is canceled. Officials at Divis became creative and will be constructing a Monarch way station on site that will benefit both the beautiful butterflies and the survivors. Called Monarch Evolved, the outdoor space will allow survivors to reflect and begin their journeys towards healing. Only native Oklahoma plants will be used to make sure the space is sustainable. Day, the Chief Development Officer with Divis, says the new space is an opportunity for the organization to stay true to its mission, vision, and goals.
We can't necessarily have an event where 300 plus people come and we get down on the dance floor and have this really amazing time, but the funding is still needed, which will really just be a long-term space, right? It's going to be maintained, kept up, kept on site, but it'll be a space where clients, their families can, maybe sit outside and do, whether it's counseling or just talking, as they go on this journey of healing. So really, it's going to be a COVID safe space, which is also really nice, but it'll also be beautiful to look at and relaxing to be able to, sit in. And so we're really excited to kind of shift that lens. But part of that fundraising piece is being flexible, being nimble in all of this, and really with that lens still of ensuring that our clients are getting every single opportunity to rebuild their lives that they can.
Hope's experiences led her to volunteer at Divis's Family Safety Center to help other survivors. She also regularly shares her story to inspire others who may be in situations with similar threads.
Every time I would just feel, I'm getting stronger and stronger.
If you or someone you know needs help, please contact Divis by calling 918-743-5763 or text HELP to 207777 from 8 p.m. to 1 a.m. 7 days a week. We want to thank you for listening to the second segment in a 3-part series examining COVID-19 in North Tulsa. Our team includes Ariel Davis, Christy Eaton, Jamie Glisson, and Colby Webster. Focus Black Oklahoma's associate producers are Bracken Clark and Ali Shaw. Our executive producer is Quresh Ali Lanzana. Thanks also to Solutions Journalism Network and Tulsa Artist Fellowship. Focus Black Oklahoma is a project of Tri-City Collective.
Our theme music is by Moffat Music. Additional music provided by Brand J and their Stand Empires, Dr. View, Recorder, and 2012 of the Music About Everything Foundation. Readings by Amarani Perez Shamu and Jerica Wortham.
Our third and final episode in the series will look at the effects the coronavirus has had on evictions and homelessness. It will air February 28th at 3 p.m.
Hi, I'm Matthew Variapa, host of KOSU's music podcast, No Cover. There, I have conversations with musical artists, like how Black musicians are creating music at the intersection of race in Oklahoma.
Why do we have these low-key racist specifications for how we classify art?
When I think of the question, what is the soundtrack of the Black Lives Matter movement? I can't think of any other place but Oklahoma.
Listen to No Cover on NPR One or wherever you get your podcasts.
Your donation of just $5 a month is a great way to become a member of KOSU and support the programming that you love. Make your donation today and become a member at kosu.org.